Hello, and welcome once again to Brooklyn Law School's series on law in time of crisis. Perhaps law in time of crises is an increasingly fitting word for this series because what started off as a conversation about the global health pandemic has evolved to address other issues of economic and social and political unrest. And here to talk to us about various of those issues is Professor Jocelyn Simonson, whose work touches on all aspects of the criminal justice system and the role of the public in interacting with and overseeing the system of criminal justice in the United States. As it happens, you have a forthcoming article in the Yale Law Journal about police reform, which is very much the topic of the moment. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what you say in that piece and what's in the air with regard to police reform.
Yeah, this is a piece that was largely written before the current crisis, and I am actively, furiously revising in light of what's happening now. But part of the idea behind it is to question some of the traditional ways that we, and by we I sort of mean elites, people who have the power to stop and think, who get to talk to police officers and instruct them how to go forward with reform. Part of the way we think about reform, I want to question. And I don't want to question it because I'm sitting here having the idea to question it, but rather because I'm seeing social movements on the ground question a few central ideas that are throughout police reform. And one of those is that the way we should think about and measure police reform is just by looking at outcomes, such as how many people were shot by the police, which of course we want to know, or how many people said that they were robbed last week, which might be an indicator of crime. That's one way to think about is something successful. Another way to think about is something successful is to survey community members and ask them what they think about the police. Those are the traditional ways that we measure success in police reform. And using that, we have largely come out with ideas like having body cameras, having de-escalation training, having implicit bias training, banning chokeholds. Things that if you look at a place like the Minneapolis Police Department, we've already had for a lot of years. And yet we still have something like George Floyd being murdered with a knee on his neck for 8 minutes and 45 seconds. And so that kind of way of thinking about police reform is in sharp contrast from what you'll see movements asking for. And it used to be that I'd have to explain that a little more, but now I think we're starting to hear what it is that they've been asking for years, which is power over how the police department operates and some kind of power over, more broadly, how we use state resources to provide safety and security. So in the first instance, what I mean is if we decree that now the police officers are going to have body-worn cameras but then keep their own footage, or have a ban on chokeholds, but then it's the police department that internally disciplines them, that's not shifting any inherent power dynamics between police officers who walk streets with guns and the authority to use them and the communities in which police officers have a higher presence, which of course tends to be poor communities of color, especially Black and Latinx Americans. And so unless we shift that power through, for instance, having a civilian oversight commission that doesn't just discipline individual officers, but gets to set larger policies that are binding for the police department. Or there's an idea of having community control over the police, which might mean in local districts. In New York, we might think of it as precincts. There would actually be elections to decide how the police operate, some kind of really low-level democracy. Those are some of the ideas of shifting political power. But then more broadly, and I think this is the idea that's gaining currency and that we're at least starting to see and read about and understand now, is the sense that police themselves are a disempowering force in a neighborhood or in a community. That it is alienating to have people walk around your neighborhood with guns when you know they might use it against you, or you know that statistically you're more likely to be shot by them if you are a person with darker skin. So if police are inherently disempowering, then they don't necessarily make everybody feel safe. even though we tend to associate policing with safety. It turns out that people actually have very different views over whether the police make them feel safe. Some people they do, some people they don't. Sometimes it's a complicated mixture. So, one demand from social movements, and this is not a new demand, but we're hearing it loudly right now, is to look more broadly at how anything, a locality, a state, or the United States government spends its money when it says, we have this pot of these many billions of dollars or millions. How are we going to spend it? Under the heading of safety. And so what you'll see is people developing people's budgets where they sit around and they spend a lot of time in political analysis asking what keeps us safe? What makes us feel safe? And a lot of times the analysis that comes out of that is that more funding for schools makes kids more engaged, and then we all feel safer. More money for healthcare makes us all feel safer because to be exposed to disease is a violence of a certain kind. Stable housing makes us feel safer. Any number of things. And less policing also makes us feel safer. So that's where we get the calls to either divest from policing and invest in communities, or to defund the police altogether. Just to take an example from this week, in Los Angeles, a big coalition under the heading of Black Lives Matter, but a lot of different groups, after hours and hours and hundreds of people coming together, brought a people's budget before the Los Angeles City Council that is now up for debate. And the people's budget takes money away from jails and policing and invests them in other kinds of things. So these two ideas of divesting and investing or defunding and giving direct political control to the police officers, just to circle back, if you plug those into our traditional measurements of success, it's not clear they're going to work. Mm-hmm. But if you stop and ask, do these situations shift power? Then maybe that's another way to say our police reforms haven't really worked in the past, so let's try this different way. So that's a very long answer to what my paper is about, but what's exciting to see, as much as there's fury and anger in the streets, I'm very heartened by the public's attention to these long-standing demands from social movements. Whether you agree with them or not, my hope is that you're reading about them and listening to them and thinking, does that make sense to me? What makes me feel safe? What makes other people feel safe? Let's have that conversation. It's a new conversation on the table right now.
Well, this popular uprising you're describing and all of the protests that are taking place have, among other things, led to a lot of arrests. That, in turn, has led to a renewed interest in bail funds. You've done a lot of work in the past about bail funds. Maybe you can take a moment to explain to us, what are bail funds and why are they important?
Bail funds are a basic level, a group of people that gets together with money to post bail for strangers, not because they know a person. If we think about bail, sometimes it's a mom giving money so that somebody will be released and therefore come back to court. It's paying bail for strangers out of a larger belief in the injustice of money bail, and very likely the injustice more broadly of things happening in the criminal system. What a charitable revolving bail fund is it takes that pool of money, and because when you pay bail, when somebody comes back to court, which most people do, the money comes back to you. And so revolving bail funds can exist over time, over years. They still need money, but the money eventually comes back. Mm-hmm. And so what they can do with that is not just free people, although of course that's important, but by freeing people, make a larger statement about what certain ideas within the criminal system mean to them. And the two ideas that really stand out to me are community and public safety. So in most bail laws, including in New York, the word community is in there. And it's in there as a reason to set bail for somebody. You want to incarcerate somebody because it'll keep the community safer. But now imagine a community bail fund comes in and they say, actually, we feel safer if this person is released so that they can be home with their family, not lose their kids, not lose their job, rather than some abstract concern that something's going to happen if we release them. So that shifts the calculus that a judge has to make if over time a community bail fund keeps freeing people. On top of that, they change our notions of public safety, actually in ways that are parallel to some of the ideas we're hearing about policing and safety, which is not a coincidence because it's the same movements that are over time generating these new ideas. But constitutionally, public safety is the lodestar, the reason that rationally we say under the Due Process Clause and the Eighth Amendment, the government is allowed to detain people pre-trial. That might make sense intuitively. You detain someone pre-trial because the safety of the public, we're concerned about it in some way. Again, in a rather abstract way of potentially this person might hurt somebody. Well, when a bail fund comes along and says we feel safer when somebody's free and reminds us that to be incarcerated is also a lack of public safety for that person incarcerated, that changes that calculus as well. So bail funds exist over time, both to free people and to be part of larger pushes to change our laws and policies around money bail, pretrial detention, and really incarceration itself. And they've been around in some form for a long time. People have always passed a hat in their church to collect money to bail somebody out. And the Movement for Black Lives reminds us that during slavery, slaves would free themselves with money, and they'd also gather money together to free other slaves. So there's a long-standing tradition of collectively liberating somebody. But this idea of a revolving charitable bail fund is a relatively new phenomenon in the US. It's really risen in the last 10 years. So when I started studying bail funds in 2015 and 2016, there were 5 or fewer charitable bail funds that were regularly operating. By the beginning of this year, there were more than 60. And now if we fast forward to today, my understanding is that there are at least 98 groups that are collectively posting bail for strangers in these weeks. So we're seeing really an explosion or a rapid expansion of the use of bail funds as a tactic to free people, but also to be part of larger pushes for change.
The COVID-19 pandemic, which has hit jails and prisons particularly hard. Maybe you can tell us a word about what is happening in law enforcement facilities and what the government has been doing in response.
They have rarely heeded any calls for mass release. So in a state like New York, there are calls to release a lot of people, hundreds, thousands from prisons to save their lives, and the governor has granted fewer than 10 cases of clemency. So it's really quite a contrast between what people are calling for and the responses that we see. And it's not over. I think, the country's starting to reopen, but in jails and prisons, this crisis isn't anywhere near over because of the health crisis there. And the crisis isn't just about people who are incarcerated, it's also about people who work there. There are a lot of corrections officials who have gotten sick and died well more than other professions. It's happening, it's ongoing. Governor Cuomo granted 3 people clemency this week, and so it was this muted celebration for those 3 individuals, but frustration more largely. And so part of what I think might be happening is people starting to pay attention a little more closely to the crisis inside of jails and prisons because of the connection to the police. And then maybe also starting to think, what is it about a jail or a prison that makes it such a place to have an outbreak, and maybe think about what how it might feel to be in a jail or a prison, which we don't all necessarily sit around and think about. How is it violent in other ways? For those who are familiar with the story of Khalif Browder, he was incarcerated for approximately 3 years at Rikers Island while still a teenager. And we know that he was in solitary confinement, but it was only later that we saw videos of him being brutally beaten by corrections officers. Recently, there was a Latina trans woman who died at Rikers Island. And I don't know if anyone's seen it, but they recently released footage from inside that shows them not giving her medical aid for hours and hours while she lay there dying. And so we have these intermittent pieces of video, but contrast those 2 pieces of video from the ubiquitous videos that we have of police officers on the street, because we're able to stand there with videos. And so that's part of the difference.
As a final question, one recurring theme of this series has been to get a sense of how the issues and scholarly pursuits of our faculty members interact with the things that they do inside the building, either what you're teaching in the classroom or the activities of the Center for Criminal Justice. How have what you've seen out in the world and the ways in which it's come into your scholarly agenda intersected with the ways that you teach or the events that we're having at the school?
Yeah, what's exciting is that all of these things swirl together and interact. So part of my scholarly pursuits are to look at how social movements interact at all these different moments. And each of those moments are things that I teach about. So when I teach criminal law or criminal procedure or evidence, we have guest speakers who can come in and talk about what's happening on the ground. But the reverse is also true. When I'm outside of the classroom working with students, these things are always intersecting. So we, at the Center for Criminal Justice, we hold a number of events over the course of the year. Our most recent one was a panel that was about prison, invisibility, and resistance. So just those things we started talking in our first question and included both scholars and formerly incarcerated experts. I teach a seminar about how social movements contest the carceral state, in which we have some of those guest speakers. And then we also have fellowships, including a pretrial justice fellowship, where students work with bail funds and court watch and do some of the things we were talking about. But more broadly, for students who are interested in the criminal legal system and all the rapid change and thinking that's happening, I'm not the only one. We have such an amazing criminal law faculty that really students are able to plug into any moment. And part of what the Center for Criminal Justice is trying to do is bring all those moments together, including all the clinical opportunities, for example, to do public defense and clemency work or to work on the prosecution side. So I have a lot of fun actually talking to students who are interested in criminal law and telling them about what we have going on.
Many thanks, Professor Jocelyn Simonson. It's been a great opportunity to talk to you about the work you've been doing, which has always been important, but now even more timely and topical than ever. Many thanks to you, and many thanks to everyone out there watching. Stay tuned and come back for our next episode in the series on law in time of crisis.